Ahead of CCTV's general election coverage on Thursday the 8th of June, I sat down with Alan Whitehead, the Labour candidate for Southampton Test. Why and how did you get involved in politics?
I was involved in politics from a very early age. No mighty revelation as to why I got involved in politics. I wanted to change everything around me. I was involved very much in student politics at the University of Southampton when I was here many years ago. So I was union president, and I then joined the Labour Party shortly after, and that's what I've basically been doing ever since. I've been MP for 20 years in Southampton. I got elected in 1997. And I failed to get elected a couple of times before then, so I've actually been contesting this seat over quite a long period.
What did you think of President Trump pulling out of the Paris Agreement?
It was just appalling, the work of a profoundly ignorant and deluded man who seems to have no understanding of the basic concepts of climate science, let alone what the position is with the United States in terms of its own sunrise industries, its own development of green and low carbon energy. I was equally appalled, I have to say, by the fact that when there was an opportunity for Theresa May to sign a joint letter drawing attention to that and objecting to what President Trump had been doing, she refused to do so.
Brexit. What do you think your party would do differently to Theresa?
Well, there's every evidence that the Conservative government, just before the election was announced, was preparing for negotiations which would very much lead to a hard Brexit. So the Labour Party in power would quite simply rip up that white paper and start again in terms of Brexit negotiations, which had a series of bottom lines, which would, for example, be based on the continuation of positive trade arrangements with Europe.
You voted against triggering Article 50 in Parliament. Some may call this quite undemocratic. How would you defend your actions?
Well, if we remember that the triggering of Article 50 was something that was only brought Parliament's way by some action in the High Court, where the courts ruled that the government couldn't just trigger Article 50 without any consultation or any discussion at all, that it had to put something in front of Parliament. And when it did put something in front of Parliament, what appeared was something like a 170-word bill, which basically said, we are going to trigger Article 50, so there. And had no bottom lines, had no discussion points in it, had no framework and framing for any negotiations to take place. That's not to say that Article 50 doesn't need to be triggered. Clearly it does, because we have decided that we are going to leave the European Union, and that's the thing you have to do.
Would you have waited quite a while to trigger Article 50 then?
Yes, I would have, because there isn't a specific timescale within which Article 50 has to be triggered. There is a timescale when Article 50 has been triggered, that you have a 2-year process to get at least the architecture and the outlines of any negotiation in place. I mean, in practice, as far as European negotiations would be concerned, there would be a whole number of things which would probably spin on for a number of years afterwards.
In the wake of the Manchester attacks 2 weeks ago, and in the wake of the London Bridge attacks only 2 days ago on Saturday, Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May have both resumed campaigning today, and they have both been almost at loggerheads with each other. Jeremy Corbyn has recently just called for Theresa May to resign over police cuts. What's your opinion on this?
Obviously, the tragedies that we've encountered during the early stages and now the later stages of the general election campaign should not be used as any kind of a political football. And they are something which I think requires a sober debate, not in the context of a general election about exactly where we go and what we do overall. But there are, I think, a number of issues which ought to be stated during the general election, about what has happened previously in the context of what we know needs to be done now. And one of the things that I think we can say with hindsight is that the cuts that took place in policing, after all, there are 20,000 fewer police in this country than there were in 2010, and she ought to be accountable for those decisions and how they panned out.
What would a Labour Party response to the lack of police in the streets of this country be?
Quite simply, to employ more policemen and policewomen and the police service. I mean, it's not just about frontline policemen and women, but it's about the decreasing ability of the police across the board to deal in a complex way with a number of the complex issues that are coming our way because of the failure of investment in, frontline police, but also all sorts of things across the board that go to back up those frontline police in what they do.
Do you think Jeremy Corbyn is strong enough now to deal with ISIS and this homegrown terror threat that we've seen in this country?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's quite clear from Jeremy's recent statements on this that he's completely committed to ensuring that we are safe from terrorism as a country, that he is prepared and willing to provide the necessary measures to do that, and that he also has a clear understanding of the wider strategies which we need to undertake in order to keep our country safe for the future. And that includes, among other things, a different stance for the UK in its foreign policy in terms of dealing with a number of regimes around the world which actually assist terrorism whilst pretending, you might say, to be in another position entirely. So I think Jeremy has both the understanding and the will to do that properly.
Is there anything you'd like to say to our viewers finally?
I think this election is started off as a presidential election with Theresa May claiming all you had to do was repeat the mantra, strong and stable, trust her with no conditions to get on with the Brexit negotiations and all would be well. The election has proved to be about much more than that. And indeed, as the election has progressed, a number of the problems in the wider vision of the Conservatives in particular for the future of this country have been exposed. And that's what I've always thought this election was about. It's not so much about what happens with Brexit. It's about what kind of country we want to see in place after Brexit has been completed.
Well, thank you very, very much for joining us.